It's a beautiful summer evening at Thornfield, so Jane takes a stroll in the garden. She can sense Mr. Rochester watching her from the house, so she slips into the walled orchard for privacy. But he follows her there. Jane doesn't want to be alone with him. It's improper, so she plans her escape. As he bends down to look at a huge moth, Jane slips past him. But he knows she's there. He's there to gently break some bad news. Jane must leave Thornfield Hall very soon. Ouch. Mr. Rochester confirms the rumour that he's getting married soon. This means Adele must go to school and Jane must find another position. In fact, he's already found her one. In Ireland. Jane begins to break down. Ireland is so far away from Thornfield. And from you, Mr. Rochester. There, she said it. They sit under the chestnut tree, and he tells her it pains him to see her go. Jane is now overwhelmed with grief. Leaving him feels like death. But Blanche Ingram is coming, so Jane must leave. Now Mr. Rochester changes his tune. He wants Jane to stay. But that's impossible. How can he ask that of her? Mr. Rochester pulls Jane into his arms and kisses her. She melts in his embrace, but soon pulls away. She's going to Ireland, and he's getting married, and that's that. Well, one of those is true because in the next moment he proposes marriage to her. Jane thinks he's mocking her, so he asks her again. But her doubt remains. What about Blanche? The truth is, it's over with Blanche. Remember the fortune teller incident? Mr. Rochester used that disguise to spread the rumour that he wasn't rich. Both Blanche and her mother gave him the cold shoulder after that. It begins to dawn on Jane that he might be serious, so she reads his face in the moonlight. He is serious. So she accepts his proposal with all her heart. Hooray! But what a drawn-out, torturous way to propose. Classic Rochester. A few minutes later, the weather turns and a violent storm descends. The euphoric lovers run, sopping wet, into the safety of the house. Jane is so busy enjoying her goodnight kisses that she doesn't notice Mrs. Fairfax watching them. She doesn't look happy. The storm continues to rage that night. In the morning, Adele runs in to tell Jane that the big chestnut tree in the orchard has split in two. Is that just a coincidence or an ominous warning from heaven? When Jane rises to get dressed, she's never felt more radiant. It's the first time in her life she's ever felt pretty. She joins Mrs. Fairfax for breakfast, which is awkward, but she decides not to tell her about Mr. Rochester's proposal. As master of the house, he should do that. Afterwards, Jane finds Mr. Rochester, who bids her an affectionate good morning. In 4 weeks, she'll be Jane Rochester. How surreal! It seems he's just as giddy because he starts talking about all the jewels, satin and lace he's going to adorn her with. This makes Jane uncomfortable. None of that would suit her. She just wants to be herself. But Mr. Rochester ignores this and tells her they're going dress shopping in Millcote today. Then, after they're wed, they'll go on a big European adventure. He's getting seriously carried away, so Jane tries to pull him back to earth. She doesn't buy into all this fairy tale talk. It's not sustainable. After 6 months of marriage, the fairy dust will wear off and he'll be as stern as ever. For now, Jane asks him to hold off on the jewels and even gets a bit sassy with him. When he starts to get annoyed, Jane is satisfied. At least he's got his head out of the clouds. He doesn't stay annoyed with Jane for long, though, and she loves him too much to provoke him further. They've also got a big day ahead. So, while Jane gets ready, Mr. Rochester goes to tell Mrs. Fairfax the happy news. But when Jane goes to see her afterward, the old lady is far from happy. In fact, she totally bursts Jane's bubble and warns her to be on her guard. This really upsets Jane, and Mr. Rochester can sense her mood when she gets into the carriage. Luckily, he agrees to let Adele accompany them, which provides a happy distraction. When they arrive in Millcote, Jane realises how much she hates shopping. He tries to buy her all these colourful, frilly gowns, but she hates them all. She negotiates him down to 2 silk dresses, one black and one grey. That's more like it. But she feels so uncomfortable with him buying her expensive things. What she needs is money of her own. That would level the playing field a bit. On the carriage ride home, Jane resolves to write to her uncle in Madeira, John Eyre. Remember, he's the one who tried to find Jane years ago through Mrs. Reed, but she lied and said that Jane was dead. He'd wanted to adopt Jane and leave her his fortune in his will. Hopefully, he's still alive. Jane rebuffs Mr. Rochester's displays of affection and refuses to dine with him while they are unmarried. In fact, she'll continue as Adele's governess, and everything will be business as usual until the day of the wedding. Mr. Rochester is surprised by this, but agrees. That evening, during their usual after-dinner conference, Jane asks Mr. Rochester to sing for her. So, he belts out a beautiful love song. Of course, he expects Jane to melt. Any other girl would, but she keeps her cool and even teases him slightly. Over the course of the evening, she manages to make him quite irritated. But Jane also knows that Mr. Rochester enjoys being kept on his toes. Jane maintains her sassy, prickly attitude for the remainder of their courtship. Every after-dinner meeting is full of thorny exchanges. And Mrs. Fairfax is proud of Jane for following her advice. However, it's not an easy thing for Jane to do. She loves this man more than words can express. But 2 nights before the wedding, Jane gets a terrible shock. She has 2 terrible nightmares, then wakes to find someone in her room. It's not Mr. Rochester. He's away on business. Could it be Sophie, Adele's nanny? But what would she be doing, rustling around in Jane's closet? The silent intruder emerges from the closet and holds a light up to see Jane's wedding dress. Jane's blood runs cold as she realises it's not Sophie, it's a tall, dark woman with long, thick hair, and Jane has never seen her before. The woman then takes Jane's beautiful veil and puts it on her own head. As she gazes at herself in the mirror, Jane sees her dreadful face. She looks like a vampire with discoloured skin, swollen lips, and bloodshot eyes. Jane watches in horror as the stranger removes the veil, rips it into 2 pieces, and stomps on them. Before leaving, the stranger looms over Jane and gets a good look at her. Poor Jane is so terrified that she passes out, just like she did as a child in the Red Room. The next day, Jane decides not to tell anyone what happened and waits for Mr. Rochester to return home. That evening, the night before their wedding, he listens to Jane's story and offers a simple explanation. It was Grace Poole, up to her old tricks again, and her goblin-like appearance was the result of Jane's overstimulated, nightmare-fueled brain. But if Grace Poole is such a monster, why is she still at Thornfield Hall? Mr. Rochester promises to explain all that after they've been married for a year and a day. Gee, thanks. Jane doesn't buy this explanation, but goes along with it to keep him happy. She also agrees to spend the night in the nursery with Adele and Sophie, but Jane doesn't sleep a wink. In the morning, Mr. Rochester is in such a hurry to get to the church that Jane barely feels her feet touch the ground. When they enter the churchyard, Jane notices two strangers lurking among the headstones, but she doesn't think much of it. A few minutes later, the modest little ceremony begins. The only attendees are Jane, Mr. Rochester, Mr. Wood, the priest, and his clerk. But wait, the two strangers are there too. One of them, a lawyer named Briggs, steps forward and objects to the marriage. He declares that Mr. Rochester is already married and his wife is still alive. Mr. Briggs then pulls out a statement which affirms that 15 years ago, Mr. Rochester married a woman named Bertha Antoinetta Mason in Jamaica. The statement is signed by her brother, Richard Mason. Remember him? Well, he's here now. Mr. Mason steps out of the shadows and confirms it's all true. Mr. Rochester knows the jig is up. There will be no wedding today. He is married to Bertha Mason, and she is the mysterious lunatic that haunts Thornfield Hall. Her mental illness is a family trait, which Mr. Rochester only found out about after he married her. Bertha now lives under lock and key as Grace Poole's patient. Let's all go and meet her, shall we? So they march back to the house, past the naive well-wishers and up into the gloomy third story. They enter the bedroom where Bertha attacked Mr. Mason last April. Remember that? Mr. Rochester lifts the tapestries, unlocks the hidden door, and ushers them into a windowless room. Grace Poole is there, as is a dark figure, moving around at the far end of the room. Mrs. Poole warns Mr. Rochester that Bertha may attack at any moment. Jane also recognises Bertha as the one who'd entered her room the other night. Bertha screams and lunges at Rochester. She bites him on the face, and they struggle. She's strong and puts up a good fight until Mr. Rochester overpowers her and ties her to a chair. Everybody, meet Mrs. Rochester. Can we blame Mr. Rochester for seeking solace in Jane? As they leave, Mr. Briggs assures Jane that she's blameless, although her letter to her uncle, John Eyre, was the catalyst for this fiasco. By a freak coincidence, Mr. Eyre works for the Mason family in Madeira, and Richard Mason was with Mr. Eyre when he received Jane's letter. Upon hearing that she was to wed Mr. Rochester, Mr. Mason headed to England to prevent the bigamous marriage. As for Mr. Eyre, he's now dying, and Jane will probably never meet him. Jane retreats to her bedroom, bolts the door, and calmly changes back into her usual dress. She thinks over the morning's events and faces the fact that her hopes and dreams are now dead. Jane Eyre is a cold, solitary girl once again. Jane knows she must leave Thornfield as soon as possible. But where will she go? We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.